We haven't seen anything like this in 100 and some odd years. 1917. You read about 1917, but in 1917, certainly not since 1917. There's been nothing like this since 1917. Who would have thought 1917? It was the Spanish flu. 1917. There's been nothing like this since probably 1917. Not since 1917 has there been anything like this. It's like nobody's seen since 1917.
They point to 1917, 1918.
It was 1917, 1918. That's a long time ago. 1917, they went through something that was similar. 1917 was the last time. If you go back over 100 years, 1917. You all know what happened in 1917. That's over 100 years ago. You look at 1917, the pandemic, it was something. The worst pandemic since 1917. 1917, that's something. 1917 was a time. In 1917, it was vicious. Everybody that writes a book about the Spanish flu, 1917.
You know, the big one was 1917.
You read about him. You read about it from 1917. A virus, the likes of which this world has not seen since 1917. The worst event of its kind since 1917 is the worst since 1917. 1917. It's a long time ago. So in 1917, we had a horrible, in that case, it was a flu, right? You remember. Many years ago. 1917, 1918, right? 1917. This is the worst thing that's happened since probably 1917. 1917, 1918. The great pandemic since 1917, many, many years ago. Maybe you go back to 1917, 1918. That was the big plague. Not since 1917. We came to that conclusion. Even if you go back into 1917, but 1917. Now, in 1917, had they had the internet and all the means of communication, they could have practiced distancing.
I've read about the Spanish flu. That was 1917.
I would say since 1917. Which was the greatest of them all. 1917, it was in 1917, 1918. The flu is nothing to sneeze at. Last time was of this magnitude, 1917. The worst pandemic since 1917. Probably 1917 would be the closest analogy. And you could go to 1917. You can probably go back to 1917. 1917. 1917. 1917. Maybe 1917.
1917.
1917.
If you look at the magnitude of the 1918 pandemic, where anywhere from 50 to 75 to 100 million people globally died. I mean, that was the mother of all pandemics and truly historic. I hope we don't even approach that with this, but it does have the makings of the possibility of being, approaching that in seriousness.
You read about 1917 and you read about certain things, but you think in a modern age, a thing like that could never happen. Well, it comes back. It is genius.